The Second World War, a complete history. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a world on the edge of something enormous. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of held breath, of people who sense, without quite knowing, that the ground beneath them is shifting. Europe felt that silence in the late 1930s. The cities were still full of cafes and music and the ordinary movement of daily life, but underneath it all, something was building. Something that had been building, in truth, for a very long time. To understand the Second World War, you have to understand the First. Not because one caused the other in any simple way, but because the First War left behind it a wound that never properly healed. When the fighting finally stopped in November 1918, the victorious powers gathered in Paris to decide the fate of the defeated ones. What they produced, the Treaty of Versailles and the various agreements that accompanied it, was a settlement that satisfied almost no one and humiliated many. Germany was stripped of territory, burdened with enormous financial reparations, and made to accept full responsibility for the war. Its army was reduced to a shadow of itself. Its people were left with a mixture of grief, resentment, and disbelief. The years that followed were difficult almost beyond description. Germany went through a period of catastrophic inflation in the early 1920s, when the currency became so worthless that people carried it to the shops in wheelbarrows. A brief period of relative stability followed, but then the Great Depression struck in 1929, spreading unemployment and despair across the industrialized world. In Germany, where the memories of humiliation and hardship were still fresh, the conditions were ripe for someone who promised simple answers to complicated questions. That someone was Adolf Hitler. Part 1: The Rise of Hitler and the Road to War. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889, a restless and difficult young man who had drifted to Vienna and then to Munich, failed as a painter, and found his purpose in the First World War, where he served as a corporal and was genuinely brave under fire. The defeat of Germany hit him like a physical blow. He could not accept it. He constructed an explanation for it, a conspiracy, he believed, of Jews and Marxists and weak politicians who had stabbed Germany in the back from within. It was a fantasy, a poisonous lie, but it gave his rage a direction, and he discovered that he could make other people believe it too. He had an extraordinary gift for public speaking. In the beer halls of Munich in the early 1920s, he found that his words could move crowds in ways that surprised even him. He joined a small political party, took it over, renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, and built it into a movement. His first attempt at seizing power, the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, landed him in prison, but prison gave him time to write, and what he wrote, a book called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, laid out his world-view with disturbing clarity. Germany needed to expand, to conquer living space in the East, to purify itself of those he considered racially inferior, and to become the dominant power in Europe. When the Great Depression hit, the Nazis' fortunes rose with the suffering of the German people. In the elections of 1932, they became the largest party in the German parliament. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, through a combination of legal maneuvering, intimidation, and outright violence, he had transformed Germany into a one-party state with himself as its absolute ruler. He called it the Third Reich, the Third Empire, and he promised it would last 1,000 years. What followed was a decade of transformation that remade Germany from the inside. The economy recovered, largely through massive rearmament spending. The streets were clean, the trains ran on time, the unemployment figures fell. But underneath the surface, something terrible was happening. Jews were stripped of their citizenship, their rights, their businesses, their dignity, step by step, through a series of laws and decrees that made persecution official policy. Those who opposed the regime disappeared into concentration camps. The press was controlled, education was reshaped. Germany was being prepared, systematically, for war. In the mid-1930s, Hitler began to test the limits of what the international community would allow. He remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, breaking the terms of Versailles. Nothing happened. He united with Austria in 1938 in what he called the Anschluss. Still nothing. He demanded the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia. At Munich, in September 1938, the British and French prime ministers agreed to give it to him, hoping that this final concession would satisfy his appetite and preserve the peace. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned home, waving a piece of paper and speaking of peace in our time. 6 months later, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion of appeasement was shattered. Britain and France began to rearm in earnest, and they issued a guarantee to Poland. If Germany attacked, they would go to war. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Part 2. The Fall of Europe. The invasion of Poland was unlike anything the world had seen. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a combination of fast-moving armored columns, motorized infantry, and close air support that crashed through the Polish defenses before they could organize a coherent response. From the west, German forces poured across the border. From the east, Soviet forces invaded as well, acting on a secret agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that Hitler and Stalin had signed just weeks before. Poland was caught between two giant powers and crushed within a month. The winter that followed, the winter of 1939 to 1940, was strangely quiet on the Western Front. British and French forces sat behind their fortifications and waited. The press called it the phony war, as if the declaration of hostilities had not yet connected with any actual fighting in the West. But the quiet was deceptive. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway in a single swift operation. In May, the main blow fell. German forces invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg simultaneously. The French and British response was to move their armies north and east to meet the expected German thrust. But the main German attack came not where they expected. Armored divisions under generals like Erich von Manstein pushed through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French had considered impassable to tanks, and emerged behind the Allied armies, cutting them off from their supply lines and driving toward the English Channel. The result was catastrophe. The British Expeditionary Force and large elements of the French army found themselves trapped against the sea at the port of Dunkirk. In late May and early June, in a desperate operation that involved naval vessels of every size alongside a fleet of civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, ferries. Over 300,000 soldiers were evacuated across the Channel to England. It was a rescue, not a victory, and Winston Churchill, who had replaced Chamberlain as British Prime Minister just as the German offensive began, said so plainly. Wars, he reminded the House of Commons, are not won by evacuations. France fell in 6 weeks. The armistice was signed in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had been forced to sign the armistice in 1918. Hitler's choice of location was a deliberate humiliation. A rump French government established itself in the town of Vichy and collaborated with the German occupation. A French general named Charles de Gaulle had escaped to London and declared, over the BBC, that France had lost a battle but had not lost the war. Almost no one was listening at the time. Britain stood alone. In the summer of 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a sustained campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and achieve the air superiority needed for an invasion of Britain. What followed was the Battle of Britain, fought in the skies over southern England through the long summer days. Young pilots, British, Polish, Czech, Canadian, Australian, and men from many other nations, flew sortie after sortie from grass airfields, intercepting German bomber formations and their fighter escorts. The losses on both sides were severe. There were days when the RAF was stretched nearly to breaking point. But the invasion never came. Germany switched its air campaign to bombing British cities, the Blitz, hoping to break civilian morale. It did not. Churchill's speeches became the voice of something that refused to give in. And the British people, sleeping in underground stations and digging through rubble in the mornings, held on with a stubbornness that surprised the world and exhausted German planning. Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely and began to look east. Part 3. The war expands. In June 1941, Hitler made the decision that many historians consider his greatest strategic mistake. He invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in the history of warfare. 3 million German soldiers, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, and other Axis forces, crossed a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial advances were staggering. Soviet forces, caught unprepared despite numerous warnings, collapsed in huge encirclements. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken in the first weeks. The Germans advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. Stalin, shaken to his core in the first days of the invasion, recovered and mobilized the vast resources of the Soviet state. The Red Army was badly led and poorly equipped in the early months, but it was enormous, and the Soviet Union had space to absorb punishment that no Western country could have survived. Cities burned, villages were destroyed. Behind the advancing German lines, special units called Einsatzgruppen followed the army and began the systematic murder of Jewish communities. Men, women, and children shot in pits beside the towns they had lived in for generations. The Holocaust, which had begun with persecution and deportation, was entering its darkest phase. The Germans drove toward Moscow. By November and December of 1941, the advance guard could see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. But the Soviet counterattack came in December, in temperatures that fell to -40 degrees. And the Germans, unprepared for a Russian winter, were driven back. Moscow did not fall. Then came December 7, 1941. the Japanese Empire, which had been fighting a war of expansion in China since 1937, launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In a single morning, much of the American Pacific Fleet was sunk or damaged. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, now had the full global war he had been edging toward for 2 years. The entry of the United States into the war changed its fundamental character. America's industrial capacity was enormous. Its factories could produce aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons at a scale that no other nation could match. But it would take time for that capacity to be mobilized and deployed. In the meantime, the Axis powers continued to advance. In North Africa, German forces under the brilliant General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, drove the British back across the desert toward Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and British control of the Middle East. In the Pacific, Japan swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies with frightening speed. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendering to a smaller Japanese force, was one of the greatest military disasters in British history. The Axis powers were at the height of their expansion. The war seemed, to many people watching, very far from won. Part 4. The Turning of the Tide. The year 1942 was the hinge of the war. It began badly for the Allies and ended with something that had not existed before, a genuine sense that the tide might be turning. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the moment Japan's naval dominance began to crack. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications and knew where the attack was coming. In a desperate engagement fought largely by carrier aircraft, the United States sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan never fully recovered from the loss. In North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein in late October and November 1942 saw British forces under General Bernard Montgomery defeat Rommel's army in a grinding attritional battle. It was the first major British land victory of the war, and Churchill, allowing himself a rare moment of celebration, said it was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. But it was in the east, at the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River, that the most significant turning point of the entire war occurred. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most brutal episodes in human history. German forces entered the city in the summer of 1942, expecting to take it quickly. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare of house-to-house fighting, where every building became a fortress, every staircase a battlefield, every cellar a defensive position. The Soviet commander Vasily Chuikov told his men to hug the enemy, to stay so close to the Germans that the Luftwaffe could not bomb their own troops without hitting their own men. The fighting went on for months. Soviet forces held on with extraordinary tenacity, while German commanders fed more and more troops into the city. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack that swept around both flanks of the German position and encircled the entire Sixth Army, some 300,000 men, inside and around the ruined city. Hitler forbade any attempt to break out. The surrounded forces slowly starved and froze. In February 1943, the remnants surrendered. Of the roughly 300,000 encircled, only about 91,000 survived to become prisoners, and of those, only around 6,000 would ever see their homes again. The psychological impact of Stalingrad was immense on both sides. Germany had suffered a catastrophe that its propaganda could not conceal. The Soviet Union had demonstrated that it could not only resist the Germans, but destroy entire armies. The war in the East had fundamentally changed. Part 5. The Holocaust. It is impossible to tell the story of the Second World War without telling the story of what the Nazi regime did to the Jewish people of Europe. And to Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and others it deemed unworthy of life. The Holocaust did not begin with the gas chambers. It began with words, with propaganda that portrayed Jewish people as subhuman, as a disease, as the source of all Germany's suffering. It moved through law, the stripping of citizenship and rights. It passed through violence, the organized pogrom of Kristallnacht in 1938, when synagogues burned and Jewish businesses were destroyed across Germany. And it arrived, by the dark logic of escalating persecution, at genocide. The Wannsee Conference, held in a comfortable villa outside Berlin in January 1942, was where senior Nazi officials coordinated the logistics of what they called the final solution: the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. 6 extermination camps were built in occupied Poland, equipped with gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. Trains ran from every corner of occupied Europe, carrying families who had been told they were being resettled, to places whose names would become synonymous with human evil: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. By the end of the war, approximately 6 million Jewish people had been murdered, 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe. A civilization that had existed for centuries across the continent, its writers, musicians, scholars, merchants, farmers, children, was largely destroyed. The enormity of this crime stands apart from the military history of the war, a darkness within a darkness, a fact that the human mind struggles to hold. Part 6. The Allied Counter-Offensive. By 1943, the Allies were ready to begin taking the war back to the Axis powers. In July, Anglo-American forces landed in Sicily, and within weeks the island fell. Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had tied his country to Hitler's fortunes, was overthrown by his own government and arrested. Italy began secret negotiations with the Allies and in September surrendered. German forces immediately occupied northern and central Italy and prepared fierce defensive lines across the rugged Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign became a slow, grinding advance through difficult terrain against determined defenders, a costly secondary front that tied down forces on both sides until the very end of the war. In the east, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. Germany launched a massive offensive against a Soviet salient, a bulge in the front line, hoping to recover the strategic initiative. The Soviets had been warned in advance and had prepared in extraordinary depth, mile after mile of anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery. The German offensive ground to a halt, and the Soviet counterattack that followed began a westward advance that would not stop until it reached Berlin. In the Pacific, American forces adopted a strategy of island hopping. Bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and seizing islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases for the advance toward Japan itself. The fighting on each island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, was ferocious and costly, the Japanese defending every position to the last with a tenacity rooted partly in military culture and partly in the knowledge that surrender was not an acceptable outcome in the code by which they had been raised. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany intensified through 1943 and 1944. British bombers struck by night, American bombers by day, in raids that grew steadily larger and more destructive. The city of Hamburg was hit in the summer of 1943 with incendiary bombs that created a firestorm, a self-sustaining column of superheated air that killed tens of thousands in a single night. The ethical questions raised by the deliberate bombing of civilian populations have not been fully resolved in the decades since, but the strategic intention was clear: to destroy Germany's industrial capacity and break the will of its people. It achieved the first more than the second. Part 7. D-Day and the Liberation of Western Europe. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in history was launched against the coast of Normandy in northern France. The planning for Operation Overlord had been underway for nearly 2 years. The deception operations that preceded it, feeding false intelligence to the Germans about where the landing would come, were among the most elaborate in the history of warfare. An entire fictional army group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, was conjured from fake radio traffic and double agents to convince the Germans that the real blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. When the blow fell at Normandy instead, it came with everything the Allies could bring to bear. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, received the first wave of assault troops in the grey light of dawn. At most beaches, the fighting was severe, but the footholds were secured within hours. At Omaha, the carnage was terrible. Men cut down in the water, on the sand, at the base of bluffs, by defenders who had survived the preliminary bombardment. Of the first wave at Omaha, the casualties were devastating, but they held on, and by the end of the day, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. The breakout from Normandy took weeks of bitter fighting through the hedgerow country of the Norman countryside. But in August 1944, American forces broke through at St. Lo, and the advance accelerated. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, with French forces given the honor of entering the city first. General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées the following day to crowds of extraordinary emotion, a city that had been occupied for 4 years, coming back to life in an afternoon. The advance continued east. By September, Allied forces had swept through most of France and Belgium. Brussels was liberated. The first German territory was crossed. People spoke, perhaps too optimistically, of the war ending before Christmas. It did not end before Christmas. In December 1944, Germany launched a desperate counter-offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, that caught the Americans off guard and created a dangerous salient in the Allied line. The weather was foul, grounding Allied aircraft and negating their air superiority. The surrounded American garrison at Bastogne held on despite everything. When asked to surrender, the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, famously replied with a single word: nuts. The German offensive ran out of fuel and momentum within weeks. By January 1945, it was clear it had failed. Germany had spent its last strategic reserve. Part 8. The End in Europe. From January 1945, the end came with gathering speed from both directions. In the east, the Soviet winter offensive of January 1945 was the most powerful military operation of the entire war. Enormous Soviet armies, rebuilt, re-equipped, and led by experienced commanders who had learned their trade in 4 years of the most brutal warfare imaginable, crashed through German defenses and drove west at a pace that stunned even the Germans. Poland was overrun. East Prussia was cut off. German civilians fled westward in the bitter cold, and the suffering of those refugees, the columns of people on frozen roads, the ships sunk in the Baltic carrying evacuees, is a story that history has taken a long time to fully reckon with. In the West, Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945. The bridge at Remagen was captured intact, a moment of extraordinary good fortune that the Americans exploited immediately. Patton's forces crossed on pontoon bridges. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr, was encircled and captured. Germany was being compressed from both sides. Hitler was in Berlin, in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, increasingly detached from reality, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. He refused all advice to surrender or to leave the city. Around him, those who had served him for years began to make their own arrangements, their own escapes, their own calculations about what came next. Soviet forces reached Berlin in April. The battle for the city lasted until the very end of the month, street by street, building by building, across a city already shattered by years of Allied bombing. German soldiers, old men and boys from the Hitler Youth, fought alongside regular troops in a defense of a city already lost. On April 30, 1945, in his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun, whom he had married the previous day, took poison beside him. Their bodies were burned in the garden above. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Germany's unconditional surrender came into effect. The war in Europe was over. It had lasted 5 years, 8 months, and 7 days. The continent it left behind was shattered almost beyond imagination. Cities in ruins, borders erased and redrawn, millions of displaced people wandering roads that no longer led to homes that still existed. Part 9. The Pacific War and the End. While Europe celebrated, the war in the Pacific continued with no sign of an easy end. The island-hopping campaign had brought American forces close to Japan itself. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945 gave a terrible preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost. On Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, nearly 7,000 Americans and almost the entire Japanese garrison of 21,000 were killed. On Okinawa, the fighting was even more costly. American casualties exceeded 12,000 dead. Japanese military dead exceeded 100,000, and Okinawan civilians died in enormous numbers, caught between two armies on their own island. Japanese forces fought with a ferocity that went beyond military calculation. Kamikaze pilots, young men who volunteered to crash their aircraft loaded with explosives into American ships, sank dozens of vessels and damaged hundreds more. The spirit of resistance seemed absolute. American military planners estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and potentially millions of Japanese ones. These estimates shaped everything that followed. In the summer of 1945, a new weapon was ready. The Manhattan Project, a secret program involving the greatest concentration of scientific talent ever assembled, working in laboratories across the United States, had produced the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a single American aircraft, the Enola Gay, dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion was equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosives. The city was destroyed in a moment. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the weeks and months that followed from burns and radiation sickness. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Between 40,000 and 50,000 people died. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio. The first time most of them had ever heard his voice. He told them the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that Japan would bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. Japan would surrender. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender was signed aboard the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Representatives of the Allied powers stood in rows. It was a clear morning, and the sun was bright on the water. The Second World War was over. Part 10. What was left? The numbers that historians use to describe the war are so large that they lose their meaning almost immediately. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died, the most lethal conflict in human history, by a very large margin. The Soviet Union lost perhaps 27 million people, a wound so deep that it shaped Soviet and Russian thinking for generations. China lost perhaps 15 to 20 million. Germany lost around 7 million. Poland lost about a fifth of its entire population. The physical destruction was immense. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in rubble. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, railways, factories had been systematically destroyed. Millions of people were displaced, stateless, homeless, living in camps or moving along roads toward uncertain destinations. And yet, from within this devastation, something began to be built. The United Nations was established. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written. The Nuremberg trials, at which surviving Nazi leaders were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity, established a principle that would slowly become part of international law, that individuals could be held accountable for atrocities committed in the name of a state. The Marshall Plan, launched by the United States, poured money into the reconstruction of Western Europe. Economies rebuilt. Cities rose from rubble. The generation that had fought the war came home and began the quiet work of building lives. Europe, which had twice in 30 years destroyed itself and much of the world in the process, began a different experiment, the slow, difficult, imperfect construction of institutions that would bind its nations together economically and politically, making another war between them increasingly unthinkable. It was a project whose full significance only became clear over decades. The atomic bomb cast a long shadow over everything that followed. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, now faced each other across a divided world, each with weapons capable of ending civilization. The Cold War which shaped the second half of the 20th century, was the long, anxious aftermath of the Second World War's conclusion. The war left behind it not only ruins and graves, but questions that the world is still working through. Questions about how ordinary people come to participate in extraordinary evil. Questions about the obligations of bystanders. Questions about the nature of political authority and the limits of obedience. Questions about memory, how to honor the dead, how to reckon with guilt, how to teach the young what happened so that it might not happen again. In the cemeteries that dot the landscapes of France and Belgium and Poland and Russia and the Pacific Islands, the graves are still there, row upon row upon row of white markers, each one a person who was young and had a name and came from somewhere and believed they were doing something necessary. The grass grows quietly around them. The wind moves through the trees. And the world they helped to make, imperfect and troubled, and still arguing about the lessons of their sacrifice, goes on. Sleep well, the world has been through much, and it endures.